Thanks, Fabian. Thanks, Klaas and Tasja for organizing a wonderful conference. We did learn a lot already. Going to take it further. And thank you especially to the last panel, the Mercator Group and Kat, for maybe the best introduction into our panel. I don't think that you wanted to talk about optimization at all, but you kind of were forced to do it. And we are going to take this debate a step further. Because there were still questions at the end of the last panel, and the thematics are kind of similar, I shortened my introductory note to the minimum. Therefore, we will have more time for debate. I think this will be fine for everyone. If somebody is interested in my PhD project or whatever, just come and talk to me. I'm not going to tell you everything about it now. I'm starting with a Foucault quote, so very classical. My body, it is the place without recourse to which I am condemned. And actually, I think that it is against this body, as if to erase it, that all utopias have come into being. And further, utopia is a place, outside a place, where I will have a body without a body that will be beautiful, limpid, transparent, luminous, speedy, colossal in its power, infinite in its duration, unethered, invisible, protected, always transfigured. It may very well be that the first utopia, the one most deeply rooted in the hearts of men, is precisely the utopia of an incorporeal body. That's from 1966. This utopia, I would propose, could be called cold bodies, warm machines. And not in the warm machinic sense. Andreas is sitting, I don't see anything. Oh, there, over there, yeah. So not in the warm machinic sense, I hope, but exactly in the notion how the subject envisions this machine, the merging of man and this machine as the transhumanist vision of the coming singularity. We already talked about that one in the morning. One of my most favorite cyborg practitioners, and I don't mean the cyborg in an emancipating, critical, feminist, Hauerian sense, I mean the technocratic, in the early vision of Klein's astronaut cyborg sense, the perfect automaton. The self-proclaimed cyborg, Tim Cannon, summarized Michel Foucault's utopian body quite nicely in the following quote. The human body is really, really failing in almost every way. I want to live to be thousands of years old. I don't understand why anybody wouldn't. This panel wants to focus on the enhancement of the human, the transformation of human capacities through biomedical engineering, the use of nootropics or smart drugs, genome editing, prosthetics, cyborgian practices of using wetware, software, hardware. Parts will look in the history of this debate, others will look at our contemporary position, at least I hope. These cyborgian practices can be as invasive as the implantation of RFID chips or biometric sensors. In our arms, we did see a lot of those things in the first presentation about the Plus Human exhibition, or the editing of the human genome, or as non-invasive as the currently ubiquitous self-quantification and self-metrization techniques through apps and gadgets like fitness trackers. The debate about enhancement and optimization, the good, the empowering capacities of enhancement technologies and techniques, and the at the same time emerging bad of the neoliberal optimization imperative, control regime, and the growing bioeconomy brings us to some of the core questions of what the human is, what life is, what it can be, and what it can become, and maybe even what it should become in the health imperative. Of course, Of course, we can place these themes inside of the debate about governmentality, or as Erich introduced it already, the environmental regime. A biopolitical Foucauldian perspective enables us to grasp the object of modulation and regulation, of enhancement, as the control of life in all its forms, in all its material forms. To enhance the human in general, to merge man and machine, is not part of my, or I think our critique at all. I propose to critique the inherent politics that we can see in the emerging field of human enhancement, from a scientific perspective, from an artist's perspective, to talk about the politics of cold bodies and warm machines. Alexander is going to be our first panelist. He's an empirical philosopher and assistant lecturer at the Leuphana University Lüneburg and research consultant at the Institut für Allgemeinmedizin der Universitätsklinik Erlangen. That's always a long thing to say. Not only Alex's biography, his academic work as well shows us how interdisciplinarity enables us to think about how bioeconomical regimes, biomedicine and digitality can be understood without only critiquing the enhancement and reformulation of the human body, but to talk about the politics of life that are much more complex than this critique. Sidsel, going to be our second panelist, is originally from Denmark, is a London-based artist who's interested in feminist and queer responses to gaming and pornography, and the penetration of the body through technology. Virtual reality and politics of labor are also part of her work. We did see one in the last film screening, the Zero Quell, so I think you get a notion of what her work is about. Her new work, I think she's going to talk about that one today, nicely forces us to question what the human is and what it can be today. The avatar, Eva 3.0, that she's going to talk about makes us experience a different form of corporality, of gender, sexuality, and post-human porn. Virtual reality, here experienced through the VR gadget Oculus Rift, questions the sometimes utopian promises of avatars, of the bodiless, as-signifying and empowering avatar. The incorporeal body, virtual bodies can be used as a part of a critique of heteronormative bodies today. We already heard Alexander Broeckmann's biography before, so I'm not going to repeat it all. I'm just going to say that I'm really glad that you stepped in and are going to join our panel. I'm really thankful for that. And he's going to give us an overview of different artists' work. Some can be labeled as bioart, and some as, your book is all about it, machine art. And I'm hoping that we are going to get into the whole question of the dichotomies and mergings of the nature, culture, and human, non-human debate with your talk. And again, I did already say it 4 times, but the politics of life. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Patiently and with a sense of awe, I find myself listening as I sit in this house somewhere outside of Philadelphia. My tea gone cold, the cake half eaten. Would it have been impolite, I wonder much later, if I had finished either during the breathless, pauseless sharing of memories by these 3 famous social researchers? In recollection, I probably had not paid much mind to eating anyway. Can one even? I mean, pay with one's mind? Well, we sure pay with attention today more than with anything else. I had no idea what and how to write this. I still remember her saying something like this, explaining that she had never written a term paper before, back in the early 1950s, when there were none of the autoethnographic writings we have become accustomed to. As a woman studying at Harvard University Social Relations Department, Rennie Fox would write her first foray into medical sociology. With nothing better to write, she wrote about her polio-ridden youth and the prolonged time she spent in the iron lung. Almost certain that she had failed the goal of the academic exercise, she was surprised when her famous teacher returned the paper with no corrections or comments inside the manuscript, but only scribbled on the title page, "What a horrible experience! Grade A." Buried in this story hides another, a sad, tragic story of a future past that involves roses, a story I will not tell you today. Nor will I interrogate and trouble the kind of prosthesis that the iron lung represents. But it serves as a troubling introduction. It serves as the noise from which we will see signals cannot and should not be carved in order to make the move away from risk, from the feeling of perilousness to the modes of production of precariousness and precarity, to the Rumsfeldian, or rather late liberal existentialisms of the known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknowns we don't know. A line of inquiry which leads me to ask, what comes after this neoliberal era, an era which, with leftist middle-of-the-roadism, was diagnosed in the terms of risk. So I ask, what comes after the risk society, and what can and what are we doing with this post-risk body? Remember that bodies are analogies or practiced and living equivocations of the city and of the state. The state or the political economy finds its sovereignty in question when Hobbes is read into beastliness by Derrida, who compares the sovereignty of the territorial state to, you guessed it, an iron lung. We are in urgent need for alternative figures and concepts to think with for our time and age. There have been and continue to be tectonic shifts in the conceptual, empirical geology of what we generally misuse when we speak of the social. A need emerges to take seriously again methodology in our conversations, instead of conducting blind method applications or staging empty theory monologues. In post-colonial sociology and decolonial scholarship, we can sense a current forged in adjusting maneuvers of the displacement of Northern theory. I have attempted to challenge students with alternative figures to be deployed in analyzing the political economy of technoscientific imaginaries, figures such as non-Western concepts of zombies, hyperbolic crocheting, or thinking with slime molds. I deployed these speculative figures to the algorithmic creation of risks and risk possibilities in digital healthcare economies, to the persuasive power of medical images, and the 20th century transformation of attention as a form of social capital in our attention economies, which created a world wherein we actually are paying with attention and what I call economies of relevance. The supposedly technical algorithmic infrastructures revealed, I explicated what the famous and often cited quip, "The map is not the territory," means in terms of revising the sociological imagination to deal with the overhanging consequences of the 20th century. This is an effort, an inquiry into thinking with Donna Haraway's fingers. For Haraway presents an invitation to think with her fingers when she speculatively thinks and figures with tentacles, among other odd kinds and oddkins that only become but therein belong. So from here on out and in the end, what I ask you to do and try is this. Think with me. When the gigantic is ignored, fails to mesmerize, or threatens to overwhelm us completely, we turn to miniature, says sociologist atomic child Lindsay Freeman in her 2016 paper on catastrophic snow globes, capturing simultaneously the power of miniatures as a tool to think with, while also giving an explanations for the trend to conducting ever more micro-studies in the social sciences and humanities, while also showing how the work that Elisabeth Beck-Gernsheim and her late husband Ulrich have created together has become so rare, work that deals with larger issues and temporalities. But hers and her husband's is also work that we now need to take both seriously and step beyond, at least methodologically. Today, here I will make three movements. The first movement is to create a conversation on methodology by conceptualizing risk as a methodology and showing how and by what it may have been supplanted and what kind of methodology we need to deal with in the decay of risk as useful. The second movement is to negotiate what my conceptual empirical laboratory will be, and it will be the body, and whatever that means. The third movement is to make a proposal, namely a proposal for what comes after risk society, namely to give an answer to the question, what is or rather our post-risk body and our post-risk society? Methodologically contained in this proposal is and now is the little theory rant, is the suggestion to render itinerant insurgent ethnographies which enable us to read diffractively diverse ethical plateaus, contact zones, and inhabited institutions which exist as embodied, enacted, and extended cognitive cultures and organizations. These emerged as essentially concrete spaces of ontopower, where forms of practice regimes, governmentality, and embodied and active agents collide in the political that affords its own somatosensory gestalts in the interactions of multiple technologies, of complex topologies of perception and decision-making, of ontologies, of the modes of producing expressivities. So I call for a transformation and reoccupation of the technological imagination in the form of discrepant paradigms that are cutting together apart translocal and transmedial sites, mobilities, and episodes to epistemically delink and resist the contemporary, quote-unquote, sets of assumptions, concepts, values, and practices that pertain in the so-called worldview of imagined communities of actors. We must enable imaginative prolocations of the authorities of explanatory accounts diachronically and synchronically from within and without. Exactly 30 years ago, the first edition of Risk Society was published, coinciding with the Chernobyl catastrophe. A revised foreword was crafted by its author for the subsequent next print run to emphasize the timeliness instead of mere coincidence. Risk Society did the work of allowing us not only to think that, but to actively study how risk produced in one place or polity affects another place or polity. It gave us ways of studying risks perceived, debated, managed, prevented. It gifted us with tools to revise how we talk and do globalization, pluralization, and individualization. It coined the terminology, often the very terms for the age of side effects, second modernity, and reflexive modernization. But as I said, it had its co-incident, its contemporary, its coeval, with whom it shares a strand of conviviality. Chernobyl, too, gifted us with matters, which are contained in Adriana Petrina's study of the social worlding of biological citizens, as well as it is unfolded in creatures and critters that live around the site of Chernobyl itself, which piqued the interest of Swiss artist Claudia Hesse-Honegger and others. We must ask here whether these or any other bugs matter, and what kinds of intimacies we do, can, should, or must have with them, as Hugh Raffles and Astrid Schrader have asked. And in doing so, we ask if these critters, too, are bestowed biological citizenship. And this question is asked in awareness of the variety of meanings that bestowal invokes. And here precisely we find the Western episteme fielding resistance to this uncanny idea of bugs as citizens of any kind. An uncanniness reflected nowhere better than in Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers. But we should interrogate in trouble not the idea of bugs as citizens, but maybe instead citizenship itself. Post-colonial sociologist Manuel Boatka exposes the exclusionary mechanism that citizenship itself presents. Decolonial writers reveal the ways and doings of citizenship as a colonial mechanism which defines and therein restricts what, especially political modes of belonging and modes of participation, are permissible. Citizenship is a Western concept of belonging and participation, a concept we have reason to subject to epistemic delinking. If a related Western trope is to think together co-productively the body and the state or the city, then what about the introduction of analogies and contact zones that bugs' bodies and our bodies make? Talking about analogous figurations, matterings, and worldings that transform bodies, cities, and states, especially in the ways that risk, anticipation, and now the post, which comes after risk and anticipation, describes, is an aesthetic. But we should interrogate and trouble this idea of aesthetic itself too. Aesthetic is a control regime that is strangely as static. It regulates tastes and sensuous perceptions and norms of bodies, cities, and states in terms of how they afford being inhabitable. If we think of a lively, fluid process instead, as Walter Mignolo suggests in proposing the term aesthesis, then we observe, quote, what we are witnessing around the world is the intervention of people of non-white color to reject white aesthetics and privileges and bring about the explosions of repressed, dismissed, and disavowed aesthesis. The aesthesis that both emerges from the colonial ruins and as the decolonization of aesthetics and the liberation of aesthesis bring about communal colonial healings, unquote. Investigating in an artistic, more than merely representation of South American skyscraper Ponte City as a becoming a mnemonic and oniric artifact of spatio-temporal narrativization that imbricates body, cities, and state, sociologist Denise Lim uncovers a colonial aesthetic that has manifested in spatio-temporal entanglements of oppression. Denise makes visible in disentangling the that and how, quote, post-colonial time endures for the fewer, because aesthesis highlights how social life is qualitatively experienced as an assemblage. Time and space are connected to bring presence to absence without depending on the depletion of agentic potential of the human and non-human. The spaces seen can shift from the actual corners, walls, and rooms of the apartment building to the intangible connections made between people, places, and things as an extension of spatial and temporal, unquote. With aesthesis, we uncover algorithmic mechanisms that produce images of the normal. Through biomedical and biotechnical images and imaginaries they inform. The aesthetics that matter and make legible how we sense, perceive, and furnish gender, aging, health, and disorder. Alfred Korzybski coined the famous saying, "The map is not the territory." Maps are removed from the actual territory. They can merely be idealizations, and yet they do affect how people interact with and even transform the territory they describe. Maps are at once hyper-universalizations and hyper-differentiations of the territory in question. Maps must universalize a territory to the point that someone who is not familiar with the territory can still read the territory on the map, but they are also differentiated. A hiking map is for tourists, a map for semi-professional climbers, a map for mining operation. Each may describe the same territory, and yet they abstract from it in highly differential ways. By making a territory readable for various people and yet open it for different potential intervention and transformations. For example, a tourist may litter, a climber may drive a hook into the rock face, a mining operation may obliterate a forest or an entire mountain. Thus it is opening and giving the map something that it is doing to the territory. By creating a virtual representation of the territory, it opens playgrounds for virtual futures and for futures past as transformative interventions. My father was a car mechanic, and his shop was often enough my playground when I was a child. And yet I have a strange and uneasy relation with cars. See, as a child on long trips, I always got sick in cars. I mean, still today, I can't read anything when I'm driving in a car or on a bus, right, without getting totally nauseous. This is, however, something that should make us pause and think a bit about the body in mobility, the body at speed, the body traveling. I want us to think together about one aspect in particular. How will human bodies drive in the futures, and what kinds of bodies should be driving?
Want to make sure you survive a car crash? Apparently you need to look like this.
The truth is that cars have evolved a lot faster than we have. Our bodies are just not equipped to handle the forces in common crash scenarios.
Meet Graham, a crash researcher, a trauma doctor, and an artist designed him to survive a car crash. Hypothetically, that big head would give your brain extra protection, and his hoof-like legs would make it easier to jump out of the path of an oncoming car. Project Graham is definitely different from previous car safety campaigns from Australia's Transport Accident Commission, and apparently he has a uniquely Australian charm.
While he's a mutant, he's a distinctly Australian one, with his laconic pose and no-nonsense stare.
He's very Australian, I think.
For Newsy, I'm Samantha Crook.
This speculative figure, Graham, is a map for a speculative future of the human body, even if he may not be the actual territory to come. But as a present future, one day a future past, this speculative future Graham is already, well, let's call him interesting. To say he's a mutant misplaces him straight into the Marvel universe and not the scientific laboratory he would actually come from. Graham, in this account, and by the mutant metaphor, can only be an X-Men. Because mutation occurs in nature and unplanned and so on and so on, of course we can clearly see that Graham cannot be a mutant but is a designed body type. But the X-Men metaphor, which resonates with pop culture consumers, is certainly appealing. It preserves simultaneously an uncanniness with the bodily difference and a kind of sympathy with the odd fellow. Furthermore, he is Australian. No, he needs to be Australian. He needs qualifications that mark him as something other than a dead object, that allow him to be a figure that figurates, that give him a world that whirls, to make him a person with some agency, a vitality, even though he's not alive. This Australian speculative figure is a body, an assemblage, not by asking what kind of a body is he, but what does his body do. And his body does a lot of work. We should not act as though his is an impossible body. Biotechnologies that we can see on our immediate horizon may indeed allow us to remake our own bodies into Australians. But seriously, we can remake bodies in his image, and if we were to do so, would we not also replicate part of this ascribed Australianness among other things? Let us stay with this troubling thought. Graham is a post-risk techno-utopia for a mainstream society which tends to bracket the I in main, as it produces new forms of stressing what will have been considered compulsory able-bodiedness in the phantasmagoria of futures past. Bodies that are rendered into the temporalities of a novel form of prognosis time, to deploy Jasper Poor's term. Traveling in her context but wearing the hat of my historian of speculative futures, I ask, what futures past are we fossilizing in Graham that will re-emerge and tell exactly what stories about how our experiential knowledges were nested? Is he an Australian man? Of course he is, and that is also the problem. As an Australian, he is a member of a national fiction and a colonial invention. In his Australianness, he is quite naturally a white male. Would it have occurred to anyone to make him, say, an Aboriginal female? Remember anyone the sensual homunculus? He too came phallically equipped. Like so many biomedical images, he was a great white male awaiting his Captain Ahab, about whose nature culture we can only spin speculative fictions. Graham thus contributes to the coloniality of being, the denial of radical otherness, and the erasure of brown and black bodies from our technological condition, from ecotopia, and from technoscientific futures. But let us rather think more of our friend Graham here, who one might suspect might not be a smash hit on the Australian or any other dating scene. Still, would any serious consideration of realizing Graham not also present a change in how we will do aesthetics and perhaps erotics? Graham is furthermore a template how the human will be remade to suit different, including machinic, radioactive, or vacuous environments. We are entering for sure an uncanny valley here, as one critic argued, and would likely prevent that these Grahams become real. But a decolonial line of inquiry would provoke the question, whose uncanny valley is it, if not that of global northern society alone? While Graham's body is clearly that of a white male, he is also beyond normal, but so are many other bodies which in global northern histories have presented as uncanny valleys at one point. Guess who's coming to dinner? Anyone? Ai Hasegawa, who is interested in all kinds of impossible babies, suggests a different approach to the production of responsibility. Speculative design implies for her the redesign of her body so that she could give birth to a dolphin. In doing this, she questions not simply species and generation concepts, but poses before us the question when and why should we offer our bodies to other species on the one hand, and on the other, she reveals the already open concepts of kinship and belonging further. Behind door number 1, we find what Donna Haraway calls oddkin. In another project, Hasegawa troubles the question of nutrition and scarcity and the uncanny valleys of bioeconomic solutions. Well, it has long been argued that insects are an excellent source of protein, and famously insects are, for example, already used to color red all things fake strawberry. There is in Western culture a particular unease with exploiting this source. Hasegawa offers a solution: the genetically edited to taste cockroach. We might imagine mass insect farms and factories. Of course, some of the roaches would get loose and become tasty infestations that go quite native. I can already see restaurant owners calling exterminators on the menti fresh roach. As if it isn't already enough when an unlucky customer happens to see one of them little plagues, now they mint up all the dishes. I wonder though what happens when two different flavors have a little romance. What kinds of new flavors would be born generations hence? Imagine rum-flavored girl roach meets minty boy roach, and the subsequent generation of mojito roaches would create a wave of unemployment for barkeepers. Apologies, it's mixologists now. After craft cocktails and craft beer now, the accidental craft roach. Daisy Ginsburg's speculative designs, on the other hand, operate as a resistance against extinction. Quote, species designed by synthetic biologists support endangered natural species and ecosystems. They compensate for biodiversity lost due to widespread monoculture farming of biomass for biofuel and chemical production. Designed organisms used to maintain or revive disappearing ecosystems would demand a relaxed attitude to biological control, risk, and ownership. But are they even alive? Once she turns this very same designing lens onto the human with its irrationalizing potential, once we ask what kinds of humans can live in these new biodiversities, the question we must ask next is, will humans be alive anymore after this reboot of the human franchise? Is our post-human future a future post-life? Few social scientists actually study what it means to be really living cyborgs, and there are enough around. Being equipped with machines, prostheses, or apparatuses is a messy business. So here we break from the future and go into the present. So imagine that all of a sudden, and this really happens, that you're beeping inside and your pacemaker is telling you that its battery needs replacement. Imagine asking a technician for adjustment of the pacemaker just because it feels wrong, only to be told that by technical standards it is working perfectly. Citing such events, Nellie Ochorn is one of the few actually studies cyborg everyday lives. And she is correct to suggest the consideration of these lives as something more than just discursive entities, but as material realities. So living in these post-risk times, what are the concepts we have as alternatives to describe what comes after risk society? Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Cthulhucene, world ecology, or the bioeconomy? My response is a different one. In what may seem an unorthodox, but I assure you quite permissible use of assemblage, my response to the question, what comes after risk society, is not digital culture or bioeconomy or Anthropocene, not the impossible, possible society, or anything of these. My response invokes the interrobang. That comes after risk society? What comes after, I propose, is the assemblage green precarity, precariousness, precariat. I propose to think of this as an assemblage because I think the various regimes, orders, positionalities, relationalities, and statuses that we can consider under the term precarity can only be separate in analysis, but not in experience of the messy reality of precariousness, as there are so many subjectivities, very complex subjectivities in play. Experiencing precariousness and surfacing into or drowning in precarity is always in relatedness, in interdependency, and in interaction with precarious others, who both already and because of the interaction belong to and participate in precarity by forming a precariat. I qualify this assemblage as green to emphasize that it affects and subjects life as both bios and zoe at every level, that it implicates while therein it also intensifies precarization. The optimizing tactics that we have negotiated at this conference and will negotiate in this panel in particular, these are deployed in this implication intensification to relate interactively between digitalization, algorithms, living things, beginning a circumvention of what is currently called the mind. The computational and algorithmic powers in machines we implant into bodies, machines that govern life, begin to interact with our gut biomes, with our skin biomes, with individual trees and entire forests without our conscious minds having any part in it, let alone us having access to the temporalities of these interactions. In this assemblage, we as humans, or as Donna Haraway suggests, as compost, encounter new forms of entanglements of oppression, which have traveled and become transdisposed from risk, as Ulrich Beck's anticipation of catastrophe, to the obsession with the possibility of risks, as Louis Amour and Mark Schulenberg have analyzed in Stepping with Deleuze's Controlled Society beyond Foucault's work of biopolitics, discipline and technologies of the self, to a new formation. A formation in the production of control of possibilities of risk anticipation across ecologies, macro, meso, micro, nano ecologies, across 1,000 ecologies, across general ecology, and doing so by the means of a precarization of everything, even if in practice this may only extend to a precarization of anything. Therein, all forms of possible labor, including above all the nano-ecologies that we are, not only the ones we are embedded in, all forms of possible and even impossible labor become subjected and affected by the coloniality of power and rendered conjointly exploitable and disposable. Biotechnological, biodigital, and bioeconomic designs, contemporary or speculative designs, will have to answer the question, whose lives are actually improved by these technologies? Investigating and intervening, we often discover that many of them obtain actually only as discriminatory designs, to quote Ruha Benjamin, who proposes various counter-strategies from resistance to biodesign, refusing consumption, biodefection, developing individual and collective modes of opting out, as well as alternative designs emerging from our learning spaces, which require not the rigidity of the STEM disciplines, but the versatility and motion of STEAM. And while I prefer decolonial options, I'm not entirely afar from the speakers of this conference. With regard to the founders of one of the founders of decoloniality, it is no accident that Enrique Dussel begins his argument in Philosophy of Liberation with Francisco Varela. The conversations I'm attempting to create with friends, colleagues, and allies in the coming years will revolve on coming together and thinking together with ideas about liberation designs, algorithmic liberation, agonistic imaginaries, generative justice, mindfulness, and playfulness as care ethics. What I work against in the academy and outside is a logic of impenetrable boundaries and logic of classifications. Instead of what I call and implicate as white-collar academia, I propose that we come together in solidarity and do dirty and messy work to create new infrastructures for knowledge work and cultural labor and create new learning spaces. This is what I call blues scholarship. I propose to create new odd kinds of solidarity to counter the anthropocenic algae bloom of a sink or swim alone and on your own ideology. Optimizing body and mind is, in my view, best achieved by learning to care for our bodies together and by thinking together with others. After invoking Donna, Denise, Lindsay, Walter Rua, and many others in this talk, I invite you, think with us. Thank you.
Don't worry about it. I mean, we'll just collectively imagine an ad for Oculus Rift, which features like this young teenager who kind of like, well, I guess uses like Oculus Rift as kind of like a masturbatory device. That is kind of like the prelude, like to some extent, or it kind of like runs into these different fantasies and stuff. Like you can find it online. But I wanted to start this talk with this quite dense quote. And apart from that, I'm not going to kind of like move too deep into theory. So, yeah, the pharmacopornographic society. In the pharmacopornographic society, the models for body control are microprosthetic. Now power acts through molecules that incorporates themselves into our immune system. Neurotransmitters alter our perception and behavior. Hormones produce their systematic effect on hunger, sleep, sexual arousement, aggressiveness, and the social decoding of our femininity and masculinity. We're gradually witnessing the miniaturization, internalization, and reflective introversion of the surveillance and control mechanisms of the disciplinary sexopolitical regime. These new soft technologies of microcontrol adapt the form of the body they control and become part of it, until they're inseparable and indistinguishable from it, ending up as technosoma subjectivities. The body no longer inhabits disciplinary spaces, but is inhabited by them. This molecular and organic structure, the biomolecular and organic structure of the body is the last hiding place for these biopolitical systems of control. This moment contains all the horror and exaltation of the body's political potential. And this quote, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but it's by Paul B. Preciado, by a book called Testo Junkie. And I guess I was interested in thinking about, maybe in relation to the topic of this panel, but also more in relation to the conference, this shift from kind of inhabiting a disciplinary space to being inhabited by one. And I was specifically interested in some speculative questions that has to do with, well, working as an artist or kind of like working with the production of CGI and VR, among other things. But the pharmacopornographer is kind of like a made-up term that I found relevant in relation to thinking about how the pornographer, or kind of like the role of the producer of pornography has been like contested in relation to like feminist politics. And so like one of the projects that I would like to show a little bit later on is called Second Sex War, and that refers to kind of the first sex war, or just like the sex wars of like the 80s that contested like the representation of like the female body. And I guess that I was interested in trying to think about porn, the production of 3D porn, the virtual kind of like avatar body in relation to this discourse, and somehow kind of trying to move into virtual reality but contesting it as an extension of capitalism, so like a space that is like defined by the same structures that kind of like otherwise would discriminate on the basis of like class, gender, race. So rather than maybe following through from like the 90s like optimism around like Oculus Rift, I wouldn't say that it's a complete pessimism, because I'm kind of like producing content for VR, so I am kind of like invested in questions around actually entering that space constructively, which was also part of, let's say, like the feminist sex war kind of like were polarized into kind of like two camps roughly, like the kind of like censorship or pro-censorship feminists and the anti-censorship feminists, who also sought like a productive role in relation to actually producing porn and kind of like testing whether that type of production could be feminist or have like political agency. But I guess like more generally in relation to my work, I am quite invested in trying to redefine institutional critique in art, but maybe with a broader concept of what the institution is or what the institution represent. And so these three like bullet points, it's like proper PowerPoint style, is kind of like open questions in relation to trying to situate like some of these inquiries in relation to being a person who is making art and kind of like functioning in the field of art. So yeah, I don't know if I should read them, but I'll do it anyways. How can institutional critique in art be redefined based on Preciado's notion of the pharmacopornographic society? What role does the artwork play if the space of the body is the space of institutional critique? Can VR impact the biomolecular and organic structure of the body? And I guess that in terms of like thinking about this impact of VR, like this, I think we also heard like previous speakers like talking about, like Kat mentioned it a little bit in relation to how there's a lot of experiments around kind of like VR and kind of like speculation around that being kind of like an empathy machine. And I guess that it ultimately speaks about kind of like the possibility of like inhabiting another body or kind of like a different identity. And I'm quite skeptical of that concept, because I think to some extent it's quite fraudulent to think that you can inhabit someone else's body when the material conditions that define that person's livelihood is very much kind of like premised by gender, class, and race. So, but that is kind of like a note, because I guess what I'll be speaking about is primarily animated material, so not kind of like filmed material. And Seroquel, as well as No Right Way to Come, as well as Diggo 3DX, is produced in a game engine. And the video that I wanted to show you, this advertisement for Oculus Rift, was also specifically kind of like situating it in relation to a gaming culture. But yeah, I guess that when I started working on the video Seroquel, I purchased a product called EVA 3.0. And while working with this avatar, I started to kind of like reflect on what kind of a product it was and how it was gendered and how it was commodified. But I'm just going to flip through like some slides from EVA 3.0's user manual. So EVA 3.0, I'm sure you're familiar with TurboSquid, but TurboSquid holds the largest stock of 3D objects globally. And so EVA 3.0 is among like different models that you can purchase on the site. And the designer of EVA 3.0 is called Nicola Ditchev. And a lot of the work went into kind of like thinking about the mode of production that goes into the production of CGI. But I guess that flipping through her user manual, I kind of like landed on this image of like the morph control of like EVA's quote unquote private parts. And I was quite interested in trying to think about like different notions of work, like mainly influenced by Silvia Federici, like reproductive labor that kind of like falls out of the category of labor, but trying to kind of like locate work in relation to the female avatar. And I started to research around the specific character and located it in one of the first VR games, or like one of the first video games that were adult video games that were produced for VR, and it's called X-Story Player. So I'm just going to, we don't have sound, I don't think. Oh, that's so weird. Okay, cool. But the sound is not on. Maybe I'll just, huh? I think. I mean, mine is on full blast. And this should have sound, so, okay, brilliant. Sorry about that. So this is from X-Story Player. I just wanted to show it as an excerpt. I guess that the recording was made like using Oculus Rift and just walking around in what one could consider like EVA 3.0's workspace, or kind of like, it's called Dark Dreams, and there's different ways that you kind of like advance in game. And it's not because I have any kind of like you know, moral objections to kind of like whatever. It was mainly kind of like trying to like locate the specific character and figure out like, who's the producer of this female avatar? What kind of an economy does she enter? Like, how is her performance scripted? Like, how is she interacting with me as a gamer? Who am I kind of like suggested to be? And there's kind of like a very kind of like clear definition of the point of view that I was interested in like trying to, in a very kind of like simple way, like reversing. So the first CGI that also came out in like a VR format was called No Right Way to Come. Again, we have a problem with I don't know, I'm sorry about this. We'll just have to say it here. This is 80 seconds, so it's really short. Yeah, so this is like the credit list. This No Right Way to Come was part of a show that happened in Cologne and also in Künstlerhaus Bremen. Sorry for the spelling. That some of you might have seen. And I'm just going to flip through some of the images from the installation of the piece and then speak about Second Sex War and maybe another show, depending. How much time do I have left? What, 5? 5. Okay, cool. We'll do this a little bit quickly. This is called Oneself. So Second Sex War is a continuation of this project, and in the production of the film called Dick Girl 3DX, again, we're kind of like appropriating existing material. So the movements that animate the characters were also purchased online. It was these animated pose sets. And also the genitalia prop that was like incorporated into like the body of Eva 3.0 was also kind of like ready-made material. I'm not going to show you Dick Girl 3DX, but I'm going to show you the way that the show was installed. Dick Girls, as you know, or probably know, is like a pre-existing category of porn. So it's not my invention, but I was quite interested in this question of like, let's say if capitalism has like an interest in breaking the binary, then how does that look? Like, how does it feed the porn industry and how does it feed this specific space? And I guess that maybe that there's also just a general note to be made around kind of like the relationship between porn and VR, because I guess that 2016 is kind of like branded as the year of VR, and there's been like a lot of suggestions in relation to kind of like porn, but I guess that in the quote that was like that I initially read out loud, there is kind of like a way of thinking about the pharmaceutical industry and also the porn industry as being kind of industries that has like an immense impact on the production of subjectivity at current. And I think that maybe when porn enters VR, there's kind of like an even stronger potential for kind of like perpetuating that kind of like very kind of like immediate and very kind of like a specific production of subjectivity. Maybe we can return to that. But I'm going to move through this, through my last 3-4 minutes, and then we can return to like some of this material and maybe like some of the questions in the discussion part. But yeah. This is the install of DigGo 3DX. The X being bracketed because I guess that in an art context, images that would normally come with like an X rating has like a form of like, I experienced at least, like a form of like soft censorship where there is like either kind of like a warning like in writing or kind of like a verbal kind of like warning before the person walks in. And I guess that was also another thing that I was quite interested in, like what does it mean when a specific type of image production is prescribed in that manner, or kind of like when the viewer is kind of like probed to look at porn, because this will be, regardless of whether it's critical of porn or not, whether it's an appropriation or not, it will kind of like fall into the category of porn. So it was also like some of the things that I was interested in relation to a lot of feminist discourse that addresses that issue. These are stills from DigGo 3DX, and as you might have noticed, like the install was in portrait format, which is more kind of like following like the body proportion, but it also exists in like a landscape format, which is the stills that we're looking at current. This piece is called Site Workflow, which is the company, or the digital art company that I worked together with in producing the pieces. Yeah. This installation is called Second Sex War Zone. This is I Slave, Non-Dualistic, and Wannabe Dig Girl. It's a laser cut drawing on plywood. And this is No Baby on the left and Untitled on the right, and Site Workflow again, and No Right Way to Come. This is a drawing, it's called Methylene Blue Diluted by Female Ejaculation. And the piece on the wall is called Cultural Capital Cooperative Object, and it's made by a group of artists in London, including myself. But we don't have time to actually move into that, so I'm just going to, say thank you.
I'm happy to realize that we are all not speaking about optimization. Although some of the references in my paper will be to the notion of optimization, so don't be surprised. After my lecture yesterday, you will also not be surprised to hear that I don't feel so comfortable with the idea of linking the current discourses on optimization and enhancement culture to the concept of the human as machine, der Mensch als Maschine, suggested in the title of this panel. The human as machine, in my understanding of technology and culture, is an idea closely connected to the anti-subjectivist movements of the avant-garde of the 20th century, that is. You will find claims for the human to become machine-like in the more radical versions of second-generation futurism, or in the avant-garde attitude of dispelling the myth of the artist as a creative subject. Pop artist Andy Warhol repeatedly lay claim to such an image of the self as a machine. He said, "The reason I'm painting this way is that I want to be a machine, and I feel that whatever I do and do machine-like is what I want to do." This attitude combines postmodern melancholia with Warhol's branded pose of indifference. Again, I quote, "I think everybody should be a machine. I think everybody should like everybody. Being a machine means you do the same thing every time you do it over and over again." Similarly, the German playwright Heiner Müller, in his text Hamletmaschine, refers to the machine as a condition of escape. It is the escape of man from woman, the escape from sociality and the public sphere that is represented in the play by 3 TV sets, which are set up on stage playing live TV programs like in an installation by Wolf Vostell. Their monitors turn black after the following statement: "My thoughts are wounds in my brain is a scar, I want to be a machine, arms for grasping, legs for walking, no pain, no thought." Ich will eine Maschine sein, Arme zum Greifen, Beine zum Gehen, kein Schmerz, kein Gedanke. I don't think that this is the type of optimization that the conference organizers had in mind when they wrote the abstract for the panel. And there are important reasons in the conceptualizations of technology that distinguish this desire to be a mindless machine from the contemporary desire to be oneself and to come closer to what a healthy self I could be by means of technical, pharmaceutical, and behavioral enhancements. The sociologist Nicholas Rose, in his book The Politics of Life, suggests not to reject the new regimes of subjectivation, but to try and understand them as the space of possibilities available to us today. He describes how the scientific research and economic product development lead to organizational and behavioral changes. His focus is on the new forms of government, on how subjects are governed and how they govern themselves. I believe that this comes close to what philosopher Rosi Braidotti has proposed as what she calls post-human subjectivities. In her reading, they are the result of transformations in the relationship between humans and their environments, transformations which Braidotti summarizes under the 3 concepts of becoming animal, becoming earth, and becoming machine. These concepts represent the critiques of modernist notions of the human, which, if we follow Braidotti, has become untenable in our age. And we can tell how even Braidotti's language is still rooted in this transition from the fact that she uses as vectors of her analysis the old human companions of animal, earth, and machine, all 3 of which I think we also have to put in inverted commas if we take the transition of what she calls the post-human, if we take that seriously. Because if there's no human, or if the human changes, then of course animal, earth, and machines will also change. I don't know whether we want to seek a more clear-cut break with our humanness. Personally, I already said that yesterday, I fear living in a society that abandons the ideals of humanism in favor of post-humanism, not because there aren't many problems with the regimes of humanism, but because in my fantasy, the regimes of post-humanism will be even more terrifying. What Braidotti advocates is a spirit of experimentation. And that brings me to the examples of artistic practice that I want to present to you this afternoon. Speaking about her post-human project in general, Braidotti writes, "A post-human theory of the subject emerges as an empirical project that aims at experimenting with what contemporary biotechnologically mediated bodies are capable of doing." And I think we've seen some of those already today, not least in Catherine's presentation earlier. These non-profit experiments, Braidotti writes, with contemporary subjectivity, actualize the virtual possibilities of an expanded relational self that functions in a nature-culture continuum and is technologically mediated. I have brought a few examples of art projects which explore such experimental subjectivities. They are all engaged in more or less transforming and hybridizing the human body, though not in a language of optimization. In fact, all of the artists I'm presenting would probably reject the ideology of optimization in favor of a language of experimentation. But this is maybe a good point of discussion for later. Some of the questions that such experiments help us to formulate with regard to the culture of enhancement and optimization are: what motivates the experimentation? What are the goals or standards according to which the body transformation is taking place? What are the benefits of the experimentation, and who is it that benefits? So I've brought some examples that relate to these 5 experimental strategies: prosthetic, cosmetic, pharmacological, interspecies mingling, and fictionalizing. And because of the time frame, I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. Let me begin with 2 projects that use the motif of the prosthesis. Artur Chmiejewski made a whole series of such full-figure portraits in which the missing part of one body is visually and functionally replaced by another body, and in which the bodies of the different performers or models are shown to complement each other. A hybridization of different human bodies, either maybe in the example to the left as a heuristic completion, or the example on the right as diversification and multiplication. The dancer Lisa Bufano and choreographer Heidi Latzky developed a performance for 2 dancers, one who has amputated limbs and the other able-bodied. In the performance, both dancers have stilts strapped to their arms and legs so that having hands and feet or not does not matter anymore. Both dancers are experimentally put on a par as transformed, extended bodies. And what is perhaps interesting conceptually for our present context is that the enhancement is not pointing towards the ideal of a so-called able human body, but suggests an insect-like, furniture-like, 4-legged potential body. The lifelong project of Australian artist Stelarc has been the experimentation with his own body, with prostheses, with implants, with suspensions, and the insertion of the body into technical assemblages. Foundational for Stelarc's exploration of the boundaries of the human body and between human and technology is the claim that the human body is obsolete. I quote Stelarc, "It is time to question whether a bipedal, breathing body with binocular vision and a 1400 cc brain is an adequate biological form. It cannot cope with the quantity, complexity, and quality of information it has accumulated. The most significant planetary pressure is no longer the gravitational pull, but rather the information thrust. Gravity has molded the evolved body in shape and structure and contained it on the planet. Information propels the body beyond itself and its biosphere. Information fashions the form of the post-evolutionary body." End of quote. One of the suggestions that Stelarc has made for countering the inherent deficiency of the human body is the application of an extra ear on his forearm, and I hope that you get the irony of these proposals and also the irony of the claims that he makes in his discourse. An extra ear through which it would become possible for the arm to listen and to transmit what it hears to the internet through a wireless connection. This displacement of the sense of hearing would transform the topology of the body, and it would transgress the usual internality of its perceptual apparatus. Two interesting additional aspects of this project are the fact that Stelag had huge problems with infections that were sparked by the ear implant, threatening at one point the entire functionality of his arm and pointing to the physiological limitations of the also infectious human body. And then Stelag did several ear-on-arm performances in which the themes of externalization, of displacement and return are staged in an almost Oedipal constellation of the body with its extra ear lying on a giant model of the same arm. Besides such prosthetic inversions, another strategy of bodily transformations has been its cosmetic and surgical enhancement in the work of the French body and media artist Orlan. Since around 1990, Orlan has been performing in cosmetic surgery operations which deal with the supposed ideal of the female body. The discourses on female beauty are critically reflected and made part of the transformative actions. The parameters here are not set by improved or alternative functionality, as in Stelag's performances, but by social expectations about the aesthetics of the human body and their historical, in part art historical, construction. It would, I think, be interesting to compare the criteria and values that govern Orlan's project to the protocols that underlie the cosmetic transformations suggested by Adam Harvey's CV Dazzle project. Here, the goal is to design facial looks that will not be recognized by a computer vision system, therefore CV Dazzle, computer vision Dazzle, that will not be recognized by computer vision systems as a human face, and to prevent public surveillance systems from being able to recognize the face, let alone identify the person. This is a form of technological camouflage, cosmetic camouflage following the logic of a technical system and its algorithmic configuration. It is another example for the necessity, if we want to understand the regimes of optimization, to look at the protocols and the rules set to which the enhancements or transformations of the human bodies respond. Sorry, there's probably a heavy image in there. The topos of the psychopharmacological experimentation, which corresponds to what Sidsel earlier referred to as Preciado's notion of the pharmacopornographic. This topos of psychopharmacological experimentation comes closest to what Nicholas Rose has analyzed as the new type of neurochemical selves, as he calls them, neurochemical selves, that are constructed, maintained, and performed in the collaboration of the pharmaceutical industry, the medical sector, civil society activists, legislative organs of the state, and human beings. This assemblage and its multiple layers and protocols was addressed in the project PsychoS by the artist group Übermorgen. One of the group's members, Hans Bernhard, had intensively used synthetic drugs like ecstasy, meth, and speed as part of his life in the emerging media, digital, and techno cultures of the 1980s and 1990s. After further medication with psychotropic drugs, he experienced a major mental crisis in 2002, which was diagnosed later as the outbreak of a polar manic depression. For years, Bernard then documented his life of psychotropical enhancement in video, in photographs, and in a blog in which he listed his daily doses of psychopharmaca. Bernard's own self, Yukiko Shikata writes, was not only projected from his interior to the outside, but hacked back into him, and the continuous loop that built up in this process probably broke down once during the synergistic escalation to make way for a new OS. The so-called self, as Yukiko Shikata writes, in this context is not something that is supported by a modern constructional rationality, but it has been formed by drugs and media culture. This certainly applies to all of us, if to a lesser degree. End of quote. The proposition of a norm at which psychotropic enhancement could be aimed is both fluid and political. Such hybridization, in Übermorgen's case with psychotropic substances, with medical practices, with the pharmaceutical and media complex, was performed as a hybridization of species in the project May the Horse Live in Me, by the French group Art Orienté Objet. One of the artists, Marion Laval-Janté, had the blood plasma of a horse injected into her own blood cycle. On one level, the performance is a demonstration of the physical mingling between a human and an animal body in the form of an exchange of blood. It stages a biochemical encounter which raises questions about the boundaries of bodies and the possibility of a physical blood brother or blood sisterhood between different species. And you see the artist wearing horse legs stilts in the photo on the lower right, reminding us of the more stylized prosthetic legs worn by Lisa Bufano. On a second level, this performance is staged in a medical aesthetic. It requires the application of medical knowledge and procedures for its success, and in order to prevent the dangers of incompatibility and infection. It thus also points to the inherent systemic functionality of the human body and to the physiological rules inscribed into it, which also determine possibilities of enhancement and optimization. I would like to end by briefly pointing to the work of a couple of artists, who are playing a role in the broader context here in Nordrhein-Westfalen, and which both also deal with the notions of costume, of disguise, and camouflage. One is the Identitecture project by Johannes Paul Räther, in the course of which he has constructed a series of alternative selves or avatars for himself, which he impersonates in performance scenarios. We see him here as Transformella, as Transformalor, and as Schwarmwesen. Räther thus speculates both about the extending field of subjectivities and about alternative socialities. These are experiments with the appearance of the body, its organizational structure, and the ways in which it interacts with its environment, both visually and materially. Like the bodies performed by Stellac, Orlan, or Übermorgen, Räther's avatars are not bodies without organs that dream of the late industrial culture of the 1970s, but they are hyper-organized molecular bodies. In contrast to this, we can think of the more recent projects by artist group Nobotic, who have been experimenting with the hybridization of bodies, urban and agricultural landscapes, and digital media environments challenging the regimes of subjectivation that operate in and between them. But I'll leave it at that for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the great presentations. What did you even do? I don't know. Yeah. And if you are not interested to ask the first question, I have a few actually. No, that doesn't. It's actually not that easy to look from here because it's okay. No, then I'm going to start. Yeah, maybe the sunglasses would work. Yeah. So, I would be kind of interested to talk a little bit more about the sex wars imperative that you, not imperative, the sex wars discourse that is obvious in some of your works. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that, how the first sex war debate between pornography and art as a thing between empowerment and something that had to be censored maybe mirrors in the second discourse again. Do you know what I mean? Kind of. Yeah, okay. I'll try. You can be creative with my question.
Yeah, like maybe I could speak a little bit about what the porn scholar Linda Williams calls like a body genre in film, because I guess that what for me is interesting about VR and maybe in relation to how other types of moving image material has been analyzed in the past is that, well, she categorizes like the specific genre as being, she related it to pornography because pornography has like the ability to arouse, and she links it to kind of like horror, body horror, because it has like the ability to kind of like trigger a fight-flight reaction. And so this kind of like, this moving genre is somehow kind of like what I'm interested in exploring like in a VR context, because I guess that VR has the potential to maybe move further into that realm, the realm of the body to some extent, like through moving images. So I don't really, I think that maybe because porn that's produced for VR, it's kind of like at the very beginning. So like the whole discourse around kind of like censorship is maybe something that will kind of like arrive later on. Like I forgot to say that No Right Way to Come like was obviously made like after the ban against female ejaculation happened in the UK. So it's very much a response to that, but trying to kind of like think about how does the virtual body or the virtual pornographic body sit next to kind of like the actual body, and how does that sit next to like, notions of censorship.
Yeah, sure. You have just get in.
The models that are being used in the VR programs are highly stylized, ideal women's bodies. Is there a critical discourse around the shape of that body, its functionality? Like, what are there ideas about kind of further hybridizing those models, or is part of the appropriation that you actually go and take that particular idealized women's body?
I think it's so weird to speak with the microphone, but anyway.
Otherwise people can't hear you.
Yeah, it's totally cool. But just in relation to the question, I guess that the whole project is very much about kind of thinking about the like gender as a social construct, but what does it mean when you enter virtual reality and start constructing objects or kind of like commodities that we reflect ourselves in? So how does that relate to kind of like identity politics? And you're right that at current, like the female figures that are on sale on TurboSquid is like this very kind of like perfect, is this perfect female body. And I guess that the Seroquel was, like a first attempt at kind of like trying to deal with that. And there's a scene where the character kind of breaks open. And I guess in relation to kind of like a very subjective rendering of like what to do with that object, I was kind of like questioning whether I wanted to kind of like destroy this like perfect object, because it represents like an image of the female body that I might not want to kind of, it seems like a repetition to kind of like construct this kind of like body in a space that has like the possibilities for kind of like endless like diversity. So this kind of like gravitation towards something that is very kind of like conservative or kind of like commodifiable just seems like a bit of a wasted opportunity. But I know that, there's a lot of people who works in similar ways and who hack these objects. I guess for me, like the project, like both in terms of like thinking about a point of view, like no right way to come, like when you enter that production in VR, you kind of like have to inhabit the body of the female avatar while she masturbates. That's not to say that you will know what it feels like to be a woman, but it just forces a different point of view in what is otherwise a mainstream production of porn that assumes like a universal male viewer. So yeah, that is very much what the project is about somehow, like moving into the production of these objects in order to kind of like actually question the economy that starts to shape them to some extent.
Could I just barge in? Because I think that Alex actually said in your presentation that there's this shift from aesthetics to aesthesis. Or aesthesis, or what is it in English? I don't know. Yeah, okay, but everybody understood. And I would be interested if you take that from the digital turn, that is kind of the whole perfect representation of the aesthetic field in the virtuality, but do you bring that in combination, or does it have anything to do with each other?
Well, in the way I apply it, it does. But I have to say, and I mentioned that I take it from Walter Mignolo, right? So it's not necessarily my concept. And Denise Slim, who I mentioned, also applies it from her work. For me, it applies in a kind of a different way, because I'm very critical of this hypostasis that we give to the idea of digital culture and digital age to some degree, because what I've done in my book, Digital Coloniality of Power, was to open a critique and say, digital culture in many ways is an extension of the colonial logic, which is centuries old, right? Several centuries old. And if we want to trouble that and make digital culture into a really different kind of place, a truly democratic place, not in this kind of sham democracy that we criticize every day in our media nowadays, and the media critique itself is kind of a sham and blah, 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 we know all this, if you want to do this, we need to really trouble the aesthetic forms and make them more fluid and rethink them in terms where we can move to places instead of, having our tastes be in these prefixed forms. And the perfect form through this like perfected, normalized male gaze is a very typical form. If you think about how young boys today, and there are studies done, learn about, sexual intercourse, it is through internet porn at a very early age. And there's a lot of people, including therapists, including social psychologists, but also, not just feminists, but also feminists, who say, this is not obviously real sex, but they learn a kind of very, static form of sex there. So we need to trouble that, and we need to find ways of troubling that and make it more fluid and take this static form of sexual aesthetic and erotic out of it.
But I think especially the examples you gave, Andreas, are kind of practices, experimentations to disrupt this whole notion, to be able in the virtual, in some kind of play and game with a corporal body and the digital body, to disfigure this whole notion, isn't it? Or kind of politics?
Yeah, no, I would really be more interested to hear what people have to say now than to repeat myself.
Hi, I do have a question, and I think extends on the theme that you're speaking of now. And I guess it's about engaging with the virtual reality space, because because entering that space, you know, and I guess it's picking up on what the other comments were, it seemed like a very normalized type of space, where the sort of the sexual engagements and even the gaze to the sexual engagements was a very sort of homogenous and normalized type of engagement. But immediately, what I think is how that normalization is at a tension with the promises of virtual reality. Because the promises of virtual reality was that it would open up a speculative space for the human to almost enter into some sort of abstract prosthetic of themselves, whether that be effectually or any other sort of semiotic type of means. But it seems as if I've had limited encounters with VR, but it seems like the spaces that I have encountered with seem to be sort of just hyper-normalized spaces. And in that sense, it's just a simulation of the reality that we experience, as opposed to a speculative space that you would say would disrupt, you know, these types of normalities. You know, so in a way, you know, a virtual reality porn space would actually be more of a space for the crash test dummy than it would be for the other models that it's currently sort of engaging with, because that would sort of disrupt this sort of area. But I'm curious about your thoughts of engaging with that space, and why, in its newness, is the first entry into virtual reality resistant to this sort of hyper, sort of almost science fiction type of speculation into what reality could be?
Yeah, to be honest, from the images that Sidsel showed, and kind of in response to your question, I think that artists working with game modifications, they have already achieved some of the things that you're pointing to, at least in a conceptual sense, and it would be a matter of, you know, translating that into sexual models and kind of perversions or hybridizations. If, you know, I'm thinking of the work by Joan Leandre, Spanish artist who in around 2002, 2004 did modification on game engines and really exploded the Euclidean logic of those spaces. And one of the reasons why I showed the image from Artur Chmielewski at the beginning with the multiple men standing next to each other is that, you know, that formation that they create for the photograph is not one able body anymore, and it's not two able bodies or two partly able bodies complementing each other, but it's a really completely different figuration. And for me, that's an image for how we could think also in the virtual space. And I think there's an obligation to work in a direction like that and really use the potential that the digital medium offers. But the trend within the capitalized culture that we are in is to go in exactly the opposite direction. So I think we're struggling against a huge industry that is completely opposed to what you're saying.
But I guess if I understand your question right, you're asking why this reluctance to actually kind of like try to think with the everything is possible. Yeah. I guess maybe it's like maybe this also kind of like feeds back to kind of like the sex wars in terms of like thinking about the relationship between bodies and images of bodies and representation of bodies in relation to how they're commodified. And I guess that I can't think of virtual reality, and maybe there's, you know, a lack of imagination, but outside of it, like other than being an extension of the capitalist reality that we are currently part of. So I think that there's a similar corporate logic to this space and because of that, there would also be a similar corporate logic in virtual reality. So, and I think that the branding of virtual reality is really what makes it possible to actually provide or kind of like install a form of illusion of kind of a kind of total like post-identity space where you can kind of like inhabit it equally, when we know that, you know, regardless of how long we wear Oculus Rifts, we'll kind of like be bound by our kind of like bodies, or kind of like the, you know, the things that define our like chances of survival, and kind of like define our conditions of life and livelihood. So yeah, and then at the same time, I think that maybe the way to kind of enter that space is through a kind of like careful analysis of how that space is produced, and that only by a diversity of producers in that space would that space kind of like actually reflect a different type of logic, if you see what I mean. Because I think that there's a specific demographic right now that enters that space and uses it constructively. And I guess, yeah, I guess if I was to be kind of like optimistic, or kind of like hopeful, or kind of like see that diversity or anything is possible, I would see that as being kind of like, you know, almost kind of like providing access of tools to that space as like the first entry for kind of like talking about that as being a possibility.
I have a question about how do you see the piece, is it No Right Way to Come? How do you see that challenging gender norms, or offering an alternative to what's already there? Because in a way, I can also see it in a gallery setting, and people just ogling it as any other porn that they would see, and it sort of fulfills a lot of fantasies. I'm wondering what in your mind is the critical aspect of that work, or how do you want people to see it?
I think, again, the piece was made in relation to the ban that happened against female ejaculation in UK-produced porn. And I guess that in responding to the ban for me represent a way of the reason why female ejaculate was banned in UK-produced porn is because it contains more urine than universal male cum, and therefore it's deemed obscene. And so the visual representation of female ejaculation is like, you know, it's a contested image, because the cum shot will always be associated with a commodification of sexuality, regardless of how you twist and turn it. But I guess that maybe it was just like the best way to kind of like try to channel like some of that stuff into an image, and then attach in like a message to it. Because I think that by kind of banning female ejaculation, you're also kind of, female ejaculation was not the only thing that was banned. Like a lot of other sexual practices that predominantly like women and non-binary people would derive pleasure out of was banned from kind of like appearing in UK-produced porn. And I think that that is political. So it was a way to kind of like open up to that conversation, and whether that's successful or not is kind of like a different question. Like there is like, you know, there's friends of mine who expressed like a real discomfort by looking at the images, not in terms of like its pornographic nature, but mainly in relation to a point of identification, that if she was touched in that way, in that mechanical way, she would associate that with pain. So I think that it's not kind of like a clear decoration. For me, at least, like those images does not pass the message kind of like seamlessly, or kind of like without a friction. And maybe it's that type of image production that at least like interests me at current, because it does something. as like a vehicle for kind of like addressing some of, the things that I just said.
I think the last question, but I think we have to wrap up after that.
Okay, I'll try to cut it short. 2 questions, short ones. First one, I'm wondering how the message would have changed if you would have filmed real female ejaculation instead of a virtual one, or a generated one. Question 1, and question 2 is it still isn't it wrong to talk about a post-risk society? Shouldn't we talk about a pre-risk society, and how would that change things?
Should I just take the first one really quickly? I guess that the whole premise of producing this piece was to kind of like focus on the female avatar, and like you could say that I entered into the production of porn by proxy because I wasn't using my own body. And I think that there's a very significant shift in how we understand performance and how we understand the risk that was involved in kind of like the relationship between feminist practices that use performance as a medium, and how you can try to kind of like resituate performance in relation to CGI and animated performances. So it's something that I'm really interested in, and I think for me it was crucial that it wasn't my body, or that it wasn't like a real representation of female ejaculation, but it was a mediated one, and that
So did I understand you correctly? Or like instead of post-risk, we should say pre-risk, as in before? Free of risk. Pre-risk, as in before risk. Yeah. There's a number of thought that this sparks. I mean, the first one is you could say, oh, we live in like a cyclical history. Like we always go from cycles to pre to post and post to pre. We could look at it that way. One of the things I didn't talk about, in which would be in a longer version of this performance lecture, is like, what does the post actually stand for? Because post can stand for various things. It can mean, so we live in a time after that's gone, or we live exactly in the time of risk, because the risk society is the one where the risk is, this idea of risk is just coming, and once it's realized, we're posted because it is here, You could look at the post in that way. Or you could say post means this concept has never existed. Right? If we say we live in a post-modernity, or a postmodernism, could mean that modernism and modernity has in a sense never existed, and it was a fiction, right? That was useful, and we were talking about modernity, but it is not. So you can approach this in different ways. You can say the post means different things, right? So do we live in a pre-risk society? I mean, this could mean, from a theoretical point of view, for sociologists to step back. You could say, oh, well, there's different places in the world. These places in the world live in a risk society, these in a pre-risk, these in a post-risk. So that would complicate things, right? I mean, it is one way to think with it. And as I said, like, what is the post-risk society? For me, I replace it with another concept. For me, it's like not whether it's post-risk or pre-risk. The post-risk society for me is this assemblage of precarization of everything, becoming this green precarity, precariousness, precariat, right? So how would that be troubled and interrogated if we use again pre-risk? Would be an interesting conversation. You can have it. That's yours.
Or you can discuss it.
I have to get to my train.
5 to 10. Oh, okay. Then you're just going to jump on the train. Okay. Thank you very much.
Panelists, we'll do a 5-minute break and then continue with the conversation with Inka Arndt and Sascha Puflep here. Thanks.